Good morning, everybody. My name is Sandy Carroll. I'm the CEO of the Berkshire County Board of Realtors, and I'm going to cover just a little bit about the settlement today as we are headed into August and crunch time, as we say. We're going to talk a little bit about how we got here, do a settlement overview, cover the practice changes that we all need to make by August 17th, and then any contract revisions that we've done locally, and just kind of give you an overview of what is happening now as well as what to expect in the future. This is the same presentation that we've done for the membership two times in a modified version of what we had presented to the broker owners. So buckle up, here we go. I do want to just start with a few cautions first. One of the first things that we want to talk about is antitrust. And normally I do this as part of a classroom to say, with the questions that we are talking and asking about, we're never going to talk about commissions, and we are going to not talk about specific business practices about how you're going to handle and how you're going to talk to your clients. That is really a broker to broker decision and shouldn't be talked about in a group format like this. So what I'd like to caution you about is when you're out in the field too, to kind of remember those same principles. This was the basis of an antitrust lawsuit. So you want to make sure that you're staying on top of things and that you're not violating antitrust by kind of colluding or discussing or, creating plans with other brokers. Now, you should be actually talking within your office, in your brokerage, to determine how you're going to handle things, strategies that you're going to use for your collective clients and things like that. So definitely within your office, but not outside. That's one of the reasons we've been doing a lot of training, one-on-one, like the board office will come out. I know Mar Legal Counsel also does the same. And it's because we're not your competitors. We don't hold licenses. We're not in the marketplace to serve buyers or seller clients. So because we're not competitors, we have a bit of a hands-off approach for antitrust issues. So, and I do want to say too, obviously, I'm not a lawyer. I feel like I should have a law degree after all the meetings that I've been sitting through, all the legal meetings, but I don't. So, anything you should refer to your own personal counsel, your own private brokerage counsel, or the MAR Legal Hotline is a phenomenal resource. So take advantage of that. They are all about the settlement. They know everything there is to know about the settlement. They know about all of the state forms as well as what's happening statewide and nationwide. So they're a really great free resource for Berkshire Realtor members, and encourage you to use them. I can tell you through our decision-making process, we have obviously collaborated a lot with the state association and their legal team. We've also worked with local legal counsel. Um, we have actually created this PAG. So it was a presidential advisory group of leaders, current presidents. Nick Geranius is our current board president. Paula McLean is our current MLS president. Both have done an amazing job leading their boards through these kind of massive changes. And they've created this group that looks at all of the information, is studying how things are happening throughout the nation, is reading the news, is reading a lot of materials that I send and making really solid recommendations and sharing this in a format where it's digestible for our board of directors to make good decisions. So also on that PAG are our incoming presidents, which is Andy Pernick on the board side and Jim Thurston on the MLS side. And then we have our past presidents, because they've done so much travel on our behalf, have attended these legal council of MLS meetings and are really in tune with all of the issues. And that is Jay Nocher on the board side and Eric Sternagel on the MLS side. He's also Contracts and Forms Chair this year. And then we have a few at-large members who are also in the process of, going to state meetings, going to national meetings, and that is Pam Roberts and Courtney DuPont. So we have a really solid group of people who are looking through everything, filtering all this information, studying, debating, analyzing. And what they ended up deciding to do is, and to present to the board of directors who adopted their recommendations, is to create change to preserve broker choice, to not dictate to a broker how they should do business, but to allow our contracts and our languages and our rules the opportunity for brokers to do business in any manner that is consistent with the settlement. So we did not make proactive changes in the Berkshires. We made changes that are required for the settlement. And what that means is our contracts didn't change a whole lot because we actually had very transparent contracts. We were actually pretty proud of our contracts going into this. And so we made some tweaks that were needed, of course, to comply with the settlement. But we didn't make proactive changes. We didn't say, as an industry, we're going to strip out any sort of allowable compensation. We didn't say that we were going to make a drastic change. Basically, what we said is what you do in your office is your office policy, but our forms are going to provide you with the ability to do business as you legally can right now, and that is consistent with the settlement. What we do know, though, is that you can expect change ahead because there's many forces at work. There's many conversations. We're just learning how to do this along with you. So we're a little bit ahead of the game, but we know that there are changes afoot. The Department of Justice is still very interested in real estate and how we practice. They've weighed in on some settlements, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but they are working now directly with NAR. NAR is trying to understand if they have any concerns. What can we do to have an alignment of some of our common goals? Because we all care about consumer protection. And so that's where NAR has proactively reached out and said, instead of having an aggressive or having a adversarial role, let's try to sit down and talk to the Department of Justice. So things might change, but right now, everything that you see is for the National Association of Realtors settlement. And so this settlement is in relation to the Sitzer-Burnett case. It was litigation that you probably heard about. It was a class action lawsuit by home sellers related to broker commissions. It was related to how the MLS required there be compensation in order to list a property for sale in the MLS, and the requirement that realtors list their properties that they take. So those two things were the basis of the claim. And so what happened is there was a jury trial for the antitrust case. The jury was out. I don't think it was even 2 hours, and they came back with damages in the amount of $1.78 billion, billion with a B. So as the National Association of Realtors and some of the other named brokerages in that case started to talk about settlements. Some brokers started to talk about even before the case actually hit the courts, and then NAR actively pursued not only appeals, because they did look at appeals, but also settlement options. And that's where they came to this point where they felt like it was in the best interest of the membership and the association to move forward on this. I can tell you that part of the settlement is no admission of wrongdoing, saying we didn't do anything wrong, but in order to satisfy some of the claims and resolve them, we will make some changes in our industry so that it is responsive to the sellers, the sellers that brought the suit. It's again, a class action suit. So they're trying to determine who that class is right now. What's nice about the settlement is that it resolves claims not only against the National Association of Realtors, but also you, realtor members, realtor associations, realtor-owned MLSs like we are, and all brokerages within NAR with a realtor as a principal whose residential transaction volume in 2022 was under $2 billion, which is, I would have to say, probably the majority of our members. So the Berkshire MLS affirmatively signed into the settlement. The Board of Realtors is included, and so we're all kind of check that out. So we have 10 marketplace changes we need to make as an MLS. We're going to talk about 4 specifically that we're just wanting to make sure that you know about, 2 that are the big ones. And this is by August 17th. So that is the date of the settlement date where every compliance has to occur. So we have out there this August 8th date, and I just want to clarify, August 8th is the date that our software technology, Flex MLS, is actually going to remove commission fields as part of compliance with the settlement. So the technology is going to change on August 8th. You still have to comply by August 17th. We all have to comply by August 17th. That is the sacred date, so to speak. But you're going to find things changing perhaps in advance, because on August 8th, you're going to see the MLS change take place. So you're going to have a week and a half or so to be able to get used to some of the changes and ask questions and see how this facilitates in practice. And hopefully you're maybe using contracts now taking a look at the contracts and forms that are available, because there are two primary things that realtors need to change going forward if they want to be a member of the Berkshire MLS, maintain realtor membership, and have this class protection. The first is cooperative compensation is no longer in the MLS. It can be established and must be established outside of the MLS. So cooperative compensation, we're going to get into this, all the different ways that sellers, agents, and buyers agents can discuss compensation, how buyers agents can be paid, things like that. We'll talk about in detail, but it's all done now outside of the MLS. So that's a significant change. But it doesn't mean you can't get paid, and it doesn't mean that you aren't valued for your work. So that brings us to number 2, which is buyer agreements must be used before providing brokerage services. And we're going to talk about that in a little more detail, obviously, as well. So those are the 2 fundamental changes that you would need to make in order to comply with the settlement. And the first is no offers of compensation in the MLS. Anywhere outside of the MLS is fine as long as it's with the seller consent. So we're going to talk about the 4 ways that, quite frankly, current compensation is offered, can be offered, may be offered, and the 4 exact same ways going forward that compensation can be offered, may be offered, could be offered, with some nuance changes. So listing broker paying a buyer broker compensation, we always call the co-broke. That's still allowed in the settlement. So that is 100% allowed, but it has to be with the seller's approval. And it is something that it needs to be outlined outside of the MLS. So in the past, if a listing broker wanted to offer a portion of their compensation to another realtor, they would put it in the MLS. And when the other realtor submitted an offer or a purchase agreement for their client, it was an acceptance of that offer. Like, we're going to go forward and I accept the compensation that you listed. Otherwise, you're rejecting the offer and you're, putting in different compensation terms. That binding offer is going away because it's coming out of the MLS, so you need to do it elsewhere. And it needs to be done only with the seller's approval. So we'll talk about these 4 in more details. I just want to cover the 4 in basic terms first. A seller paying buyer broker compensation is still allowed as long as it's with the seller agreement and consent. And that was always the case. I don't know how much in your marketplace, but we've always had where the compensation in the MLS, for whatever reason, was not satisfactory. Offering a listing broker to buyer broker compensation arrangement wasn't satisfactory. And the buyer broker would basically say, I reject that offer. And on behalf of the buyer client, the buyer requests that the seller pay the buyer broker compensation as part of a purchase and sale agreement. We've seen that before. So not a startling difference going forward. A buyer paying for their own broker has always been allowed. This time, obviously, with a new buyer agency or a buyer agreement, so that they understand going forward what services you provide and also what payment you would expect. And then a portion of closing cost credits used for buyer broker compensation is still allowed. And so that one's a little bit trickier with what we're going to talk about, but we'll get into that as well. So allowed buyer broker to broker compensation. It's allowed by this NAR settlement. It is allowed by mortgage lenders. It is something that you have to discuss with your seller to cover all of the terms that will make the sale a success for them and how they can calculate and compare offers accordingly. And you would convey that in many different ways in conversations on your website if you would like to, but not with the MLS feed. So offers of compensation can't touch the MLS in any way. It can't be in the MLS. It can't be in a remark of MLS, and it can't be any way that uses our data feed. So just keep that in mind. It has to be completely separate. So on flyers, obviously in emails, you're gonna be communicating a lot more with buyers agents and listing agents about compensation than you had before. And then these agreements would need to be bound in writing, whether it's a purchase and sale agreement or an addendum. You're going to need to bind them in writing. The MLS used to bind these agreements, but now without it in the MLS, you're going to need to do that separately in writing. So a little change there. The exclusive right to sell agreement was changed to make sure that we were consistent with the settlement terms. The first thing we did is we added broker compensation is fully negotiable and not set by law, a big requirement of the settlement. You'll see that is in pretty much all of our contracts going forward. whether it's a buyer agreement, anything, we have broker compensation being fully negotiable everywhere as we can possibly do it. Now, our exclusive right to sell, as you know, was pretty transparent. It was very clear about professional services due. We did add an option for paying a fixed dollar amount, not just a percentage of the purchase price. So that is available. And then again, this is in the first section, how much a seller is going to pay their listing agent. And then the second paragraph relates to, does the seller give permission for the listing agent to give a part of that compensation named above to other brokers, buyer's agents, or facilitators? Or can they make other offers of compensation outlined in paragraph 13? So this is where the listing broker establishes whether or not the seller allows them and authorizes them to pay part of their compensation to a listing broker. And that is a change that's happened as part of the settlement. In the past, I think that brokers drove that decision. They said, hey, it was my money, and if I want to split it with a buyer's agent or facilitator, I can do that. And you just noticed the seller about what your office policy was for compensation for all of your listings. This is a little bit of a shift because now the seller drives that decision. So they're gonna maybe modify or think about their contract terms kind of a little separately, number one and number two. So you just want to make sure that you're very clear about that. I'm very clear about the impact and how the presentation goes and how the broker is going to be allowed to market their property and what they're going to be able to say to cooperating brokers. Very important conversation that you're going to have at this stage. I also want to point out the last line in the second paragraph, which says, in the event that the seller negotiates with a buyer to pay compensation to a cooperating broker that exceeds the offer made by the broker herewith, the seller will be obligated to pay the difference. And so I just want to clarify what that means. So the seller is approving whatever is being offered in this contract, and the broker is able to bind basically that offer if an offer comes in. If there's a cooperating broker who wants to work with them on this property, they can say, yes, I would make a promise to pay you. So what this is saying is that if a contract comes in, however, with a purchase and sale agreement, and it has more compensation than what is listed here in any fashion, the seller is understanding that they're going to pay that. They're going to pay the extra because this is a very fixed amount in the exclusive right to sell. And obviously then everything is negotiable in that purchase agreement. So it kind of makes sense that the seller understands this first step and then they understand its relation to the second step. So, and here's where I've just highlighted the changes that were made to that contract, just so that you can see what jumps out at you. These are all live in Remine, which is the MAR free forms platform. They're also live in Dotloop now, and should be live by Friday, August 2nd in ZipLogix, and the beginning of next week, the week of August, I guess 5th, in DocuSign. So those are the status updates. Everybody has access to Remine. If you're a Berkshire Realtor member as part of Flex MLS, go click that button. If you're having any technical issues with that because you've never used it before, definitely get in touch with us and we can get you some support numbers as well. So somebody had asked about timing, and the National Association talked about the timing of a listing broker to buyer broker agreement. When would this co-broke agreement, when should it be made? And so they said, really turn to the NAR Code of Ethics, Article 3, specifically Standard of Practice 3-1, to see that before touring home is consistent. And don't forget that, you know, as part of a broker to broker agreement, it becomes an arbitrable matter. So even if it's outside of the MLS, you're still bound by the arbitration rules as a realtor. So think of it that way. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be executed, but the negotiation and the timing of that should be done in advance, just so that the buyer has a full understanding of what might be obligated to them when they need to reframe. If they're going to consider making an offer, they need to have some facts about this. So understand that. You're going to probably get calls that are asking for showings and then asking some questions about compensation as well. So yeah, expect that. So just to reiterate, if a seller says, no, I don't want the listing broker, I don't want you to pay the buyer's agent anything on my behalf. And a listing brokerage could say, our policy is not to do this, that the seller and the buyer can work it out directly. That is a directive that needs to be followed. So make sure that you're understanding definitively that if your listing brokerage says no, you need to talk to your seller about that. If your seller says no, you cannot offer a part of your commission, even if you want to. So one of the benefits that, or some of the benefits that NAR had put out about a broker-to-broker agreement is that it memorializes the compensation between the agents, in most cases prior to a purchase agreement. So it alleviates some pressure and it provides some transparency for the buyers. It may be made in a separate document. We do have MAR's document 311 that we'll talk about in a little bit, or a purchase agreement, and it is designed to reduce confusion or misunderstanding of an offer of compensation. It's also helpful because it is instructive in the event there's a dispute. It can go through the arbitration process. So those are some of the benefits that NAR talks about. And I would encourage you to look at Form 311 in the MAR contract library. It's called a cooperating compensation agreement. It's between a listing broker and a cooperating broker, they call it. We call it a buyer's broker at this point. And it just allows you to confirm and to agree upon the compensation that is being offered on a particular property in advance of submitting an offer to purchase or a purchase and sale. I will tell you that we have a Berkshire form in development. It's in the approval process and it's coming. It a little bit more closely matches some of our agreement terms and things like that, and includes some extra language about being arbitrable, just so that it's very clear for everybody. But it's something that you're going to want to look at for those listing brokers who say, yes, we're going to offer you compensation. You might want to lock it up with this agreement. So I'm going to just take a little segue because we were talking about the exclusive right to sell. And I just want to let you know, if you've been using an existing exclusive right to sell, there are additional disclosures. You know that all compensation is negotiable and not set by state law. Yeah, that statement needs to be included, and we need to remind clients that are existing that that is the case. So you don't need to get a new contract signed after August 17th to comply with the settlement, but you should alert them that all compensation is negotiable and not set by law. We have an additional disclosure for existing exclusive right to sell agreements. That is in the contracts. It's a very simple form. It just says, just to let you know, this is something we need to disclose to you, and you can sign for as receipt of having received that notice. And then the same exists on the buying side as well. So on the left hand, we talk about the buying contract. Some people have been entering into our buyer agency agreements, or exclusive right to buy agreements, all along. So this is, again, just an agreement that says two things on the buying side. One is that all compensation is negotiable and not set by law. It's spelled wrong in that slide. But the second thing is that the buyer's agent cannot accept more compensation than is in the buyer agreement. So that's a little new twist as well. So we'll talk about that when we talk about buyer agreements. But just know August 17th, you're going to want to have updates if you're using older contracts. Just to let you know, our buyer broker representation agreement released 7/24, and it is a different name. So keep in mind, it is a different name. It's available to you right now, and you can start using it. And for any of those, you do not need additional disclosures. Just you're fine to move forward after this August 17th date. And the same thing for the updated exclusive right to sell. If your contracts with either client say in big red letters, if you're using ours, all compensation is negotiable and not set by state law, then you know that you have an updated contract and you don't need these. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us as well. And here's a sample of both, just the body of those. And it's just a very simple, like, it's just an acknowledgement that brokers can't receive compensation for any source that exceeds, that you've provided the disclosure, that it's not set by law. So very simple. That's a bigger version. So this is the million-dollar question that we're getting right now, which is, can buyers and buyers brokers rely upon an offer of compensation that was in the MLS prior to the effective date of the MLS policy changes? It's a really interesting question. We've had people saying, go start printing out listing sheets because you want to capture all that compensation that was offered. It doesn't matter, because unless you have an executed purchase agreement, it really doesn't matter at that point. The only thing going forward where that MLS offer is bound is if you have an executed purchase and sale agreement or offer to purchase. So in the MLS, the listing broker made an offer of compensation by act of the buyer's agent putting that offer together and submitting it and having it executed was an acceptance of that compensation offer. So the National Association said that the buyer's agent should be able to rely upon that offer of compensation because it was made with an understanding, the offer was made with the understanding of that being paid. However, anything after that date, um, that it's from being removed from the MLS, so now we're talking about the August 8th date, um, then all bets are off. Those were offers that were never accepted. They're not enforceable. You need to establish something separately in writing to bind an offer if there is one from a listing broker. And so just make sure kind of after August 8th, you're going to have to create your own compensation agreements henceforth in writing. So I want to show you a copy right here of the purchase and sale very quickly because I think it's instructive to how things are, eventually handled at the end of the transaction. There's a whole new paragraph in here called cooperative agent compensation, and it's talking about how this purchase and sale is structured, what compensation is or is not included as part of this purchase agreement. The first option, option A, is a buyer broker's compensation that's paid by a seller's broker on behalf of the seller. And that would be something that would be established again when the listing broker made an offer. There might be a document, a cooperative compensation agreement on hand. Or it might be, if somebody's going all this way, a verbal agreement where the listing broker said that they're going to pay that. They have an exclusive right to sell that they're bound to abide by. So that would need to mirror that document. Option B would be if there was no compensation offered or not a satisfactory amount of compensation offered, where the buyer is directing their client to ask the seller to pay it at the time of title transfer out of the purchase funds. So that just clarifies that type of compensation. Option C, other terms as outlined in paragraph 35, special conditions. I will caution you to make sure that you're getting legal, lending, brokerage counsel before you write in any terms into a purchase and sale agreement, especially regarding compensation. We've already heard from attorneys about people writing things in that are obligating clients to multiple compensations or not understanding the ramifications to maybe a mortgage product for some offers. So I would highly suggest you try to really understand other terms is used for a brokerage specific issue where they provided you language, or legal specific issues where they provided you language. This is not where you start writing in as an agent things you think would be a great idea. And then option D, there's no compensation due to be paid as part of this contract. So very, very simple. It helps provide transparency to everybody. It helps the buyer and the seller say, this is what we agree. Now, each of those clients are agreeing with their own brokers how things are going to happen. And then this just solidifies, this is what is going to happen. And we agree to it for the purchase and sale price that has been set. So it's just a reiteration. It is also very helpful as far as transparency on the lending side and the legal side. They need to make all these closing disclosures. They need to make sure that they're consistent with the loan terms. And so everybody can see exactly what is going forward. So the next type that is allowed, and this is the same structure and it's the same requirements, which is seller to broker compensation. So a seller can choose or elect to pay a buyer broker directly at the request of the buyer. And that's typically as part of the terms of an offer to purchase or a purchase and sale. You figure, hey, they're saying, oh, I got this offer. Part of the term of the offer is a payment of compensation. Sometimes it's a payment of closing cost credits. Sometimes it's a new septic system. It's part of the offer. It's part of the financial issue that the seller needs to look at so that they can compare and contrast and calculate offers accordingly. So, yeah, talk to your sellers. And honestly, your sellers need to know that they could expect this and should expect this, especially dependent upon how the exclusive right to sell arrangement is working. Yeah, they should know that this could be coming. Have a conversation about what their bottom line is, what number that they're looking for to walk away with, net, not necessarily gross, so that you can help them find success in the sales and the potential offers that come in. So again, I just want to reiterate, if the sellers don't agree to a listing broker offering compensation from their portion of the selling fee, make sure that they could see it as a term coming up. And there can be no compensation in MLS. So we're just reiterating that going forward. And then buyer brokers have always been allowed to pay their own agents for sure. It has to be conveyed in a buyer agreement, and it is only bound in writing. So you should understand that when they start paying for their own, it could be a challenge for many buyers who are trying to meet like down payment requirements. So having a conversation with them as part of the buying agreement about opportunities you have for seeking compensation elsewhere on their behalf is an important one. And we cover that in the buyer's agent agreement or buyer agreement. So this talks about broker compensation is again fully negotiable. We also had a really good buyer agreement on hand. We didn't make significant changes. We did change where you can agree to a percentage of the purchase price or a fixed dollar amount. And the second paragraph there is where the buyer is directing the broker to first seek compensation, if they are from the listing broker or from the seller in the transaction. And then if so, that amount is credited to what the buyer owes in the paragraph above. So one of the most important things is the fee obtained cannot exceed a paragraph A, paragraph A. Um, when you combine all the sources of payments, people say, well, what if I get offered a bonus? What if somebody offers more compensation? I didn't want to put a lot in here because I didn't want to obligate the buyer to too much. You need to have a conversation with your buyer about that offer, about the ability to have maybe more money, and how you're going to handle that. That is a conversation. Would you modify this agreement? Would you talk to the buyer about alternative arrangements? How does your buyer want you to handle that? Because there's a strategy involved in that as well. So just understand you cannot receive more compensation from any source that exceeds what's listed here. And again, people might be modifying agreements, but you want to have that conversation with the buyer. The objective of this is to make sure the buyers understand what they could potentially have to pay, but really also what you're expecting for your services. And so don't discount that you earn a fee for a reason, that you do an important job for them, what you do for them, and that fee is what you charge for that service. So again, remember, anything has to be in writing moving forward. Without that offer in the MLS, it needs to be bound someplace in writing. It should be negotiated and secured appropriately. We do have the compensation agreement, the purchase and sale agreement. We're trying to make it an easier opportunity for you to make those binding agreements. Understand too, we're presenting Berkshire forms, but there could be other forms that you might choose to use. The MAR contract library is great. Your broker might have specific forms. So make sure that you're checking with your broker about what they want you to use as well. So I think it makes a big difference so that you understand the full scope of what you need to kind of practice with. I love this practice change. We can't break the rules and neither can you, and we can't help you do it either. So a lot of this alludes to the data, the MLS data. So what we're going to be doing is sending out revised broker data licensing agreements. So expect those. If you use a stream of data on your website, if your brokerage does, they're going to get one. And it just talks about not being allowed to use that MLS data to create offers of compensation or to create a system that creates offers of compensation, that the MLS is out of the compensation business, our data is out of the compensation business, and that's how it rolls. There are also fines in place. I hate to talk about this. I ended it in the first broker segment, and I thought I'm not ending this whole thing on fines because our goal is to really make sure that everybody's helped through this process. But the MLS has an obligation, as according to the settlement, we have an obligation according to the settlement to make sure our participants and their agents are doing the right thing and doing and abiding by the settlement. So in order for us to be covered, we have to make sure that you're doing your job here at the Berkshire MLS. So we have to ensure that you're using buyer agency, a buyer agreement I keep trying to say buyer agency agreements, but you don't need to actually establish a client relationship. That's why I'm hesitant. It's a buyer agreement. It's an agreement with a buyer. It can be by a facilitator. It can be by a buyer broker. I just want to make that clear because sometimes I trip over that buyer agency agreement because that's kind of what we present. But you have to secure a buyer agreement before showing a listed property. And we're going to talk a little bit more about buyer agreements and establishing when you need to provide it, what is the trigger. But there it is. Settlement compliance is also not inserting any compensation information anywhere into the MLS, any document in MLS, any field in MLS, not doing it cryptically, not trying to send wink wink messages. Like we won't allow that. Some of our fields are going to be restricted so that compensation and commissions might not be allowed for terms that you can use in any open field. So we have different policing. We're also going to ask if anybody sees anything funky, let us know because we all need to comply with the settlement to make sure that we're doing our job correctly. And then the last is to not use the electronic data for anything that is commingled with any offers of compensation. So for instance, one of the allowable ways that you can display what offers of compensation you're making is on your own website. And we just want to make sure that you understand it cannot be with the MLS data on your website. So you can't put it with an MLS feed. If you have a special compensation page, that's fine, but you cannot commingle it with our data. Buyer broker agreements. This is the big Megillah because I think this is the second really big change that will impact our marketplace. We know a lot of buyers, agents have been actually doing these contracts and finding hiccups for sure, but also finding that once they are able to explain their services and explain the need for these agreements, it's going a little smoother than they had anticipated. And I will too, there's some states that have required buyer agreements before brokers compensated all along. Having it before you tour a listing is causing a little hiccup here or a little heartache here, but really when you think about it, these buyer agreements must describe the services that you offer, the compensation that you would expect to receive for providing those services. And one of the NAR regulations, one of the settlement regulations is that the amount must be objectively ascertainable and not open-ended. And what that means basically is you can't say, my compensation will be whatever the seller is willing to pay me, whatever the listing broker is willing to pay me. It has to be a fixed amount. There has to be an amount that is fixed. The agreement has to say that the broker can't receive compensation from any source that exceeds the amount in the agreement. Compensation is negotiable and not set by law. I think we've said that a million times. We thought in our old contracts, leaving the blank lines was enough, but we'll put out the big disclaimer. And you have to define how and what methods of payment and allow the buyer to direct you on how to pursue compensation from other sources. So that is all laid out in our standard agreement and most standard agreements as well. Everybody is kind of updating them to meet these new requirements. But once you kind of, lay out that process, it starts to make a little sense because simply marketing your services or speaking to a buyer about creating a relationship does not trigger the need for an agreement. What does, much like an exclusive right to sell, which is actually providing brokerage services, right? So providing brokerage services are identifying properties, arranging to tour properties, negotiating on behalf of the buyer, presenting offers, counseling about financing or any of the home buying process. So when you start to provide brokerage services, that's when you say, hey, on the last slide, this is what we do. This is how much we want to get paid for it. And do you agree with the way I'm going to try to go about it? Makes sense that you would want to establish that up front. I think that you need to make sure that you understand how you're presenting yourself is an important thing, because there is value in a buyer agreement. There is value in a buyer representative who really is working hard on their client's behalf. I think it's going to change a little bit how we, as a full industry, work with buyers, and it formalizes a little bit. It makes it more responsible and more uh, I I guess it has, when it's in writing, obligations that need to be followed by everybody, which is a good thing for consumer protection issues. So somebody had asked a question in a previous class. Well, what if I'm doing like as far as counseling services? What if I'm doing a class and I'm teaching a whole bunch of people? Well, that's teaching a class. It is not providing direct brokerage services to an individual. So just understand that that is a nuanced difference. It is a brokerage service to an individual. So are you helping an individual specifically with their financial or I, I guess with their process of buying a home? So, and if so, are you going to assist them as a broker, as a licensed broker? And if so, what does that fee agreement look like? So buyer contracts also have two confusing aspects to them, because when we've been rolling this out, we understand listing brokers are very afraid, listing agents are very afraid that they can't speak to a buyer. They can't speak to them in an open house. They can't show an unrepresented buyer without an agreement. And that is not true. A listing agent is, by very definition, a seller's agent. They represent the seller. So much like you would provide an agency disclosure right now to a customer, we always used to call them customer. Now we're kind of changing our lingo to unrepresented buyer. When you provide the agency disclosure, you say, I'm a seller's agent. Happy to show you the house, but I represent the seller. You're unrepresented. You establish that they're not working with anybody. And there are certain things that you're going to be able to do for that buyer, but there's a lot of things that you won't do for that buyer because they're not your client and you're representing the best interest of your seller. So it's pretty similar to when you're dealing with unrepresented clients, right? Unrepresented customers right now. Nothing strange about that. So dual agents is where it gets a little tricky too for our members, because sometimes an agent wants to become a dual agent as soon as they meet an unrepresented buyer. And you should be cautioned that when you meet somebody for the first time and you are a fiduciary of a seller, you want to maintain that fiduciary relationship unless there is a compelling reason why you wouldn't. So, do you have an existing relationship with a buyer that is interested in your seller's house? Of course, you're going to have a dual agency circumstance, right? Because you're trying to represent both parties fully. And now you're in a limited capacity of representation because you can't represent both fully. So you're now in a dual role. At the point when you're speaking to a buyer for the first time, you are representing one side. You are a seller's agent. And to become a buyer's agent for the property that your seller represents is a little bit of a problem. Because even if your sellers agree to dual agency, what they're agreeing to is that you'll be a dual agent if you have to be. And right now, when an unrepresented buyer comes to you and say, I just want to see this house, you don't have to be a dual agent at that point. You make sure that they understand when you present the agency disclosure who you represent. You make sure they understand they are entitled to representation, for sure. But just make sure that you're checking in with your office about how you handle dual agency, specifically if you do. The other thing I think is super helpful for you to understand is, and to really even lay out, because it just helps in your mind clarify, what do I do for unrepresented buyers? If I am working on a seller's behalf with an unrepresented buyer, what services do I provide? What don't I provide? What information do I give? What information don't I give? It's helpful for you to just go through the process. The next is, what do I do for a buyer in a dual agency relationship, and a seller, quite frankly? What gets limited? What of my full client services get limited in that relationship? And then what do I offer to buyer clients? When I'm fully their representative, when it's another agent on the other side of the transaction, what are the services that I'm going to offer them through that transaction through the transaction process. And when you see those three together, you start to understand that there are different levels of service and should be different levels of service, because one you don't represent at all, and the other you represent fully, as a full fiduciary of that client. So just make sure that you're not treating everybody the same, and that you're keeping those lines very clear about what you do and what you don't do, based on your actual relationship with them. So let's take a look at the actual representation agreement that we have in Berkshire County. It's the same one we've had all along. Again, I say our agreements were super transparent. We tried to make them that way initially. Some of our agents and our brokers are a little frustrated because we feel like we've been doing it right all along, but you know, the class action case was filed in Missouri, but just because they weren't doing it right in Missouri doesn't mean that we should be penalized. And I think I think it's a good point. I do feel like setting standards for the entire industry is what the case is about at this point, and what the settlement's about. And so that's where we are. We lay out very clearly, and we've tweaked these a little bit, your legal obligations, brokers, duties, and services to your client, and what you're agreeing to. These are the basics. This is not the marketing headlines. These are just what you're going to do as a fiduciary. Now, I'm assuming that you're going to have a lot more information about what you're going to do, in a fancy way, in a marketing way, and to make sure that you differentiate yourself from any other brokerage service. But this is the basics of what you're being bound to offer. And then the second is the buyer duties. And this is structured, as you can see, just like the exclusive right to sell, where it lays out these terms in a very consistent way. So the buyer duties are just what the broker is asking the buyer to agree to. And it's things you would always work with your buyer and ask them anyways, to work exclusively with you within a certain geographic area. If you're signing a contract, you're working with them. This is definitely the first one, to cooperate and provide any personal and financial information that's needed, and especially the notice of pre-qualification letter or pre-approval within 7 days. Now, you can always modify terms of this agreement, but understand that this is the basics, saying you need to work with me. I need to make sure that you can purchase properties that I'm showing you, that I'm, spending my time, with you to try to actively create your home buying dreams. I want to make sure that we have all of our ducks in a row. You are asking them to inform you if they had any past interest in real property, just because it's really helpful for you to know what is the buyer's relationship. Have they made offers before? You want to know this stuff, right? So that you're not caught off guard when you go to make an offer and the listing broker says, geez, we already had 2 offers with a different agency for this client. So it's helpful. Brokers will make the appointments for the buyer unless they get the broker approval. And that's, again, to clarify, I think everybody has an issue sometimes with rogue buyers, as they say, who go out, and listing brokers don't find out that they actually have a representative for a little while. So trying to just clarify some of this, and going through a contract with a buyer to just says, hey, this stuff makes sense. We ask it of all of our buyers. Now we're just asking it in writing. And then making sure that the buyer knows that they need to disclose this relationship to any other broker that asks, for sure, open houses and things like that. So the representations, I think, is another important clause in the buyer agency agreement, which is that the broker does not act as an attorney, an inspector, or things like that. It's all the things that the broker is not, and that the buyer understands that they have to exercise due diligence as well. So it's definitely a concerted effort, but the buyer needs to understand what you will and what you will not do too. And that the broker is allowed to disclose their identity if needed, and that compensation is, of course, fully negotiable. We kind of already covered this page, which is the compensation that's laid out in the agreement. It could be any manner of this. We would definitely refer you to your office policy, refer you to your brokerage, because some things might be allowed, might not be allowed. Not every brokerage is going to allow hourly compensation of the agent, potentially because it could conflict with an independent contractor agreement, but it might not. So just make sure you're checking in. You might do retainers, you might not. That is a brokerage policy. And make sure you're checking in with your brokerage about your ability to negotiate All of these agreements, because the broker has to execute, these are agreements with your brokerage. They're agreements with your broker. And so we know that you're sitting, and your broker knows you're sitting at the kitchen table, you're negotiating. So make sure that you're figuring out from your broker, what is the range? What is the ability for you to negotiate so that you're not caught off guard? If you have a client request something that you just can't get approval from your broker to accept. And then I just did a real quick screenshot of, all of our other language, protection period, non-discrimination. It's a binding agreement. Um, we do still have a mediation clause in this. And so we just want to make sure that buyer agency agreement, who sees it, or buyer agreement, who sees it? Well, this is a big question. We've gotten a lot lately. I have tell your agents because this was originally a slide from the broker program. It's the MLS's job to enforce the regulation that a buyer agreement is executed before showing. It's not your competitor's job. So if a competitor asks to see your buyer agent agreement, I said start with no and then say I got to talk to my broker, which is what you should do immediately. But buyer agreements potentially have client confidential information. It definitely has strategies for your brokerage, what you're willing to accept for compensation. You might have additional terms, you might have additional documents. Those are all exclusive to that buyer client relationship. So you need to, number one, talk to your broker before you share any document outside of the firm and make sure that your broker knows if people are asking for that document. It's just like an exclusive right to sell. You would never share an exclusive right to sell. Anytime anybody puts one up in Flex and doesn't code it correctly and it displays for everybody, we immediately will take it down and fix it immediately because that's not something that should be shared with competitors. And I would hazard to say we don't recommend that you share buyer agency agreements with your competitors, buyer agreements with your competitors. As a matter of practice in Berkshire County, a lot of agents freely share their agency disclosure form, their mandatory consumer licensee disclosure form as a courtesy, and that's okay. We don't see any issue with that, to let the other side know who they represent and that they have it in writing, that they've made the appropriate state disclosures, but they're not compelled to do so. They are compelled according to the Code of Ethics. You are compelled according to the Code of Ethics to state affirmatively that you work for somebody on what behalf in writing. So if a listing broker says, what is your capacity? They do have a right to demand that you say that you're their buyer's agent in writing or you're their facilitator in writing if you're choosing not to provide a copy of your agency disclosure when asked. But sharing of a buyer agreement, totally separate conversation. So let's take a look at the purchase and sale again. We want to caution you. It's interesting that one of the things that we said about our changes is right now they're in response to the settlement. So there might be other industry changes that are coming. There might be other options that are either added or excluded going forward. But one thing that the National put out is like, hey, while you're updating your purchase agreements or while you're updating your agreements, you should put out some wiring cautions. And so we did add that to page 1 of our exclusive, our purchase and sale agreement, just to make sure that you're covering that with your clients and you're pointing it out because uh, wire fraud is rampant. I'm sure when we first started with wire fraud, it was so clumsily done that it was like, well, you probably should have told. You could see it's coming from an AOL account, even though it says my name. There were tip-offs. It's a lot harder right now. They're very savvy. And I can tell you with AI being introduced into this, even a voice verification is now a little bit problematic. So just to cover wiring just really quickly, please make sure, just like anything else, just like when you get a fraud alert on your phone for your own credit card, it's like you don't respond to that fraud alert. You actually call the number on the back of your credit card because you know you are going to initiate that phone call and say, I'm calling about a fraud. I just did that myself. And I said, I think I got a bogus text from you from my bank. And they said, no, actually that was a real fraud alert. And they ended up shutting down my account. But what was interesting is I went to respond and I thought, my realtor training kicked in. I should not do that. I should initiate the phone call. So just make sure you're talking to your clients about that. Clients are losing so much money that can't be brought back from wiring to the wrong location. So um, the other thing we did in the purchase agreement is we hadn't really touched it up in a while, so we just reordered some terms. So for all those people who memorized paragraph numbers, sorry. But like all the physical and inspection terms are together, all the legal terms are together, all the closing terms are together as best as possible, just kind of organized it a little bit. And then we added that cooperative compensation clause that we talked about earlier. So that should cover that. I would like to point out that MAR has contracts that are extremely well done. You have access to them through your forms platforms as well. So take a look. I know that people are looking at different opportunities to use different contracts, and you're more than welcome to do so. We provide these as a service, as a source. But there's nothing wrong with these MAR forms. They're quite nice, actually. What I would caution you about the MAR offer stages is that they are definitely a market that starts with an offer to purchase and then moves on to a purchase and sale agreement. So that is a little differently from our market. And so you see that their forms reflect that. When I first looked at their purchase agreement, I thought, how could a buyer's agent ever fill this out? And then I realized, oh, the buyer's agent couldn't fill this out because they don't go directly to purchase and sale. They start with an offer to purchase, and then the attorneys a lot of times will do the actual purchase and sale. So just bear some of the transactional contracts in mind, but they have great documents as well. Some brokerages are adopting their own documents, so make sure you're checking in with them if they want you to use different documents or different ways of getting some disclosures out. And I think I mean, there's nothing prohibited. I would like to explain on the exclusive right to sell side, we are still requiring an upload of those documents. That could be subject to change. It's something we're considering. We did get verification that the reason why you upload an exclusive right to sell is for a confirmation of there's about 5 fields that we go through and we look at and we make sure that there's a right to list it in the MLS, that the seller has authorized and that there's a signature by the seller that's authorizing it. We check the dates, check the price, just things. And so because we're collecting them for a compliance issue that has nothing to do with commission, then we have a right and we have a defensible reason why we're holding them, and also that they're never available as part of the database that goes out to the membership. It's never accessible to any other member. So we're always like reassessing. Are we going to go to an audit basis? We're reassessing that, but we are not making any drastic changes. On the other side, people had said, are you going to start requiring buyer agency agreements or buyer agreements to come in to the MLS to prove that we have them? And that right now we're starting with the audit basis. Like if there is an issue, if we believe that there's a complaint, if there's a problem, if we believe that there's a concern, we can compel you to give us that document when requested, but we're not going to compile every single one for every property that goes pending. We're not going to require that buyer agency agreement or the buyer agreement. So just to understand where we're at with contracts and forms, and like I said, with everything else, subject to change. So one of the practice changes, and I don't think anybody's been doing this for a while. I don't think, especially now, we could even with a straight face do this. No advertising services is free. We have to prohibit you from doing that. Articulate your value. I mean, I now more than ever, I think communicating the benefits of working with you and the benefits of why they would choose you, why they would sign an agreement with you, incredibly important, incredibly important. Showing out why you're different from competitors. Yeah, absolutely. So the other thing is people were saying, hey, if a listing broker off the bat is not offering me compensation that is suitable to meet my buyer agreement, can I just not show the buyer that listing? Absolutely not. You cannot filter listings. The buyers have a right to see every listing that matches their criteria. You have an obligation as their representative, as their professional, to explain to them Huh. Well, this doesn't have an offer of compensation. This is how we're going to handle this. And I have the Priceline negotiator just because I think that this is the time where you're going to talk and say, this is how we can negotiate your contract. If you fall in love with this house, we're going to, aggressively create a contract that works. Hopefully the seller will accept it, but like any other financial term, it's going to have an impact. Either the seller is going to find it acceptable or the buyer is going to say, I can't afford the house because I can't afford the house. I can't afford what it's going to take to purchase the house. So just know you cannot filter. You have to explain to your buyer. Your buyer has to make informed decisions. One of the things I said is, in my opinion, a buyer that is fully informed, any client, seller and a buyer fully informed about all of this is a success on your part. It really is, because once they understand it, they can make really sound decisions for themselves. You don't have to make these decisions. They're going to be making these decisions for their own best interest, and you're going to be educating them on this whole process. So, a lot of the national rules talk about concessions. Concessions in the MLS are allowed as long as they're not tied to compensation. I will tell you, our MLS has chosen not to add a concession field in active listings, um, because it is confusing. First of all, it's not binding, and second of all, it muddies the waters to a certain extent. And so I just wanted you to understand that when you read about this or you hear about this, the MLS does not currently have concessions. We have concessions after it sells, to talk about what impacted that deed price. And if you are hearing about concessions, I want you to understand that concessions are a seller payment of funds. It can be used to satisfy the buyer's debt to their buyer's agent, meaning the compensation that's promised. They're helping with that, which is something that the lending products and the mortgage and the major mortgage lenders and Fannie and Freddie and even VA have now said is something that can be paid by the seller and does not impact loan limit, percentages for closing costs and things like that. Seller concessions could also be closing cost credits. It could also be repair credits. So you have to be extremely careful how you structure your purchase and sale to not only be transparent, but to also understand that these impact mortgages differently. And our lenders need to know sometimes what a concession is for to understand how it's going to impact that closing disclosure, how it's going to impact the loan. So anytime you're getting into it, encouraging you to only add language in other terms that you have had your legal counsel take a look at, your lender take a look at, to make sure it is consistent with what they need. You don't want to disadvantage your buyer by putting in bad information or putting in information that could harm them. What's really interesting going forward is that these seller payments of compensation are considered an interested party contribution. And what it's saying, and what the major lenders have said is, sellers have always paid for compensation for their buyer agent. Sellers have always paid that. So it's not a buyer's fee that is being paid. It is not like the buyer's attorney cost. It's not where the buyers have routinely assumed that cost. This is something the sellers have always paid. So them continuing to pay it doesn't impact the loan. So I think it's interesting. So that could change too. If our market changes at all, that could change as well. So again, talk to our legal hotline, talk to your lender, definitely make sure. I'm going to do a little plug for our local lenders. They've been phenomenal. They're obviously following along and trying to make sense of this on their end as well. It's a time of uncertainty. Let's just say that for all of us. And so work through product by product, loan by loan, loan officer by loan officer to make sure that you're serving your buyer clients for sure. A few housekeeping issues just as we close up. I want to let you know that antiquated, out-of-date message board and Flex is going to be removed. Not only is it old technology, but we can't possibly police it for some of these issues. And so policing is a big part of our job going forward. So that will be removed. We want to remind you that while you're doing all these kind of off MLS offers and negotiations potentially, you cannot be using the MLS MLS email, so you can't from the MLS go in and email a group of people and send out what your compensation offer is or anything like that. Use your private email. That's cool. Go into Outlook or Gmail or whatever you use, but please don't use the MLS email. That is considered a violation. We are limiting words in remarks, any open field where you can type in compensation and commission. Are two of the biggies for sure, so that you won't be able to actually even save a listing with those words in there. We had a longer list. We're narrowing it down because we don't want to stifle your business. It was interesting in the last session, we had said the word bonus was used and everybody's like, oh, or a couple of people were upset. Oh, we can't talk about bonus rooms anymore in our remarks. And so I thought, oh, that's interesting. So it's something that will be added and subtracted. We're going to use kind of the market to drive that. But if you have a word issue, it's going to pop up in Flex and say, hey, this word is prohibited and this is why. And you can change the word and be allowed to save it, or you can call the MLS and we'll talk through how you could maybe do it different. So we do have a process for enforcement. We always have. But how we're gonna do the minutia stuff is not yet, because I think we need just to take a breath and learn from what the process is, learn what the issues are, learn, and the board of directors is not trying to make radical changes right now. They're trying to learn, understand, help us all get through it, and then make decisions about how to proceed if there are violations, how to proceed if there's something that violates the terms of the settlement. And so we'll keep you posted on that. The policy is in place for violations. You already saw that. I just want to direct you for those policy wonks, as I called them. And somebody questioned me if that was a real word, and it really is. Policy wonks is in the dictionary. But we have new rules and regulations that supports basically everything that I've talked about. Bylaws have been updated. Everything has been changed to accommodate these new requirements. So one of the things that we'll be going out to every broker will be a new participation agreement saying, hey, you understand that these are the new rules. We might have a pop-up in Flex that everybody agrees to and says, I understand going forward, these are the terms of the MLS, and I agree to them. We're, playing it by ear, but we're going to have to make some affirmative action to make sure that you know and that you understand. So expect that. For those using Zip and .loop, Zip should be by Friday. They promised us contracts usually they promised us contracts by Friday. .loop contracts are already live in, but if you use them, they have templates, you can create your own packages or templates, seller template or seller package, buyer package. Just make sure that you're going through and updating those with the new forms. They're not updating automatically. Remember about the name change of the buyer agency agreement. Is now not an exclusive right to buy. It is the buyer broker relationship agreement. That's it. And then we've added this as we've actually not added it. It has always been in there, probably underused, I would say. But it is a compensation statement for sending out to the lawyers at the end of a transaction. They send out normally an invoice. A brokerage will send out an invoice. We just laid this out so that it's consistent with the purchase and sale agreement, but it does have other things that are always kind of looked at or are required by either lenders or lawyers, typically lawyers. So just, take a look at it, see if your office is going to use it, see if this is something that's of value to you. And then I just wanted to clarify, these do not apply to commercial listings. I will tell you that the regulations in the MLS apply to everything in the MLS, but the buyer agency agreement, things like that don't apply to commercial listings. Typically, commercial listings are placed on a commercial platform. They're not placed in an MLS, maybe a commercial information exchange, CIE is where they're placed. But these regulations, these settlements are geared towards residential sales, meaning residential, condo, mobile, all that. So what's next? We have, hopefully in the Friday recap, we're going to have links to this home buyers brochure. We have a home sellers brochure as well. You can take and use uses your own. You can add your client contact info, your realtor contact info. You can print it. You can send it electronically. It's a trifold brochure. I think we're going to have a 8.5 by 11 as well, that just have some information that you can share with your clients, so that you're not trying to explain it without having some backup. So this will be your backup from your board. Yeah, and you can use it or you don't have to, for sure. With the video overview, obviously, is to be talked about in your office, shared with your office. It is exclusive to Berkshire Realtors, because a lot of the content I mentioned is only available to Berkshire Realtors. And this is how we're choosing to implement in the MLS. And so it could vary from MLS to MLS. So this only speaks to Berkshire Realtors and Berkshire MLS members. And just wanted to give you a heads up that postcards are going out to home sellers who might be considered a member of the class. And so you might be hearing about those a little bit from the law firm, saying, have you sold a home in the last 4 years? And if so, you might be entitled to compensation. We've all gotten those class action postcards before, probably. But absolutely, keep an eye out. Keep us informed of anything that crosses your desk or any questions that you might have. One thing we all agree, change is ahead, not just the changes I mentioned, but we, are expecting more in the future. So when we do contract and form revisions, typically we're like, okay, we're not going to touch the purchase and sale again for a year. We're not going to touch that again for a year. I think we're being realistic to say we might need to be tweaking things as we go. We've done our very best with the information that we have on hand, but I can tell you information is still coming in daily. It, 2 nights ago, I got an email from NAR that was like, "Oh, that's interesting. That's a new twist." And so, and it's just about disclosures and what needs to be done. So we're trying to update all of our resources and trying to keep these slides updated as well. But we're here to help. Reach out for sure. I'm going to office meetings. Can I do that? Full facts.realtor is what that says. You'll see. I can't stress enough that is the go-to place. What I'm telling you is like a Cliff Notes version. That is the go-to place for everything you'd ever want to know about settlement. And it's, as I said, NAR did an extremely well done job doing that. And then August 17th is our date. So we're all buckled in. We're waiting for it. I'll be traveling out to some offices to make sure that I have any questions answered, but I encourage you to email. One of the things I did ask in my other groups is, if you are going to email a document or a newsletter or something like that, I'd love to see that stuff. But if you could just explain why it caught your eye. I love this clause. Oh boy, I can't believe that they're doing that. Like, just tell me what I should be looking for, because I'm reading a lot. I'm looking at a lot. I'm watching videos that people are sending me. And sometimes I get to the end and I'm like, what do they want me to know? So it's really helpful if you're sharing things. I love it. Love it, love it, love it. But understand there's a ton of information that we're trying to process and make sure that we're up to date on. And I don't want to miss anything. So help me out there. So Sandy at BerkshireRealtors.org, email anytime, call. Sometimes I'm a little bit harder on the phone just because I'm constantly going, but I really appreciate your attention. I want to just reiterate, not only me and my staff, Linda and Sue, are here for you. So is the leadership team. We're trying our very best to process these changes and to do it in the consumer's best interest, and to make sure that your business can operate in the manner that you need it to. So I just want to say thanks so much, and I'm sure that we'll be in touch. I did want to share, do I have it here? I don't. I know it's the date is possibly when you're watching this video might be a little late, August 23rd. Please save the date. We have an awards banquet luau, awards dinner luau, very casual, very fun, at Proprietors Lodge, Friday, August 23rd. Registration is already up on our calendar and in our hub. but it's a great way to get together. I think after this, we're all going to need to take a little break, have a little fun, enjoy a night out, and to talk about some of the great things that have happened this year, the volunteers who have done an outstanding job, all the money we raised, all of the accomplishments, really. I mean, we've done a considerable amount collectively as a board, and we hope to see you there because we think we're all going to need to get together, have a good time, and just take a deep breath from this. So look forward to seeing you there. And in general, we're just really anxious to make sure that we're serving your business needs. So reach out anytime. Thanks so much.